She didn't cry in her room. She didn't cry in front of her parents. She cried in the barn, the only place that didn't ask her to be okay. Jasper, her brother's old horse, stood there every morning, silent and steady, when the rest of the world looked away. What began as a girl's hidden grief became a sanctuary that would touch countless lives for decades to come. This isn't just a story about loss. It's about the quiet power of staying, of presence, and the unexpected ways a single horse can save not just one life, but many. She started crying in the barn on the second day after they buried her brother. Not because she wanted to, but because it was the only place no one followed her. Not her mother, who had gone silent and hollow. Not her father, who sat in the den with the TV on all night and never moved from his chair. Not the neighbors who brought casseroles wrapped in foil and left too quickly, like they were afraid the grief might stick to them. Only the barn stayed quiet. Only the horses didn't ask questions. And only Jasper, the big dapple-gray gelding in the last stall, looked at her like nothing had changed, like she wasn't broken. Her name was Laney. She was 15 and she hadn't said a full sentence since the morning of the funeral. Her teachers called, her friends texted, her guidance counselor left a voicemail using words like processing and support and trauma. She didn't return any of them. She didn't even open the messages. She came home from school, dropped her backpack in the mudroom, and walked out to the barn every day. Jasper waited for her. She didn't brush him at first, didn't even touch him. She just sat outside his stall on an overturned bucket, her arms wrapped around her knees, and cried so quietly she didn't make a sound. The kind of crying that came from somewhere so deep it didn't need permission, just release. He would stand there and breathe. Sometimes he'd nudge the stall door. Once, he snorted so loudly she jumped. But most days he just stood still and watched her like he knew, like he was waiting. She didn't tell anyone what had happened that day on the road. She didn't talk about the curve that took her brother's truck into the ditch, or how he was supposed to be home before dinner, or how she had been the one to hear the knock on the door. Her mother answered. Laney watched her knees fold beneath her. She remembered the sound her father made, like something tearing in half. No one said the words, "He's gone," because they didn't have to. Laney felt it in her bones. It didn't matter that he was 23 and grown and reckless. He was still her brother. He was still the one who used to sneak her candy before dinner and help her study for geometry and ride bikes with her down the gravel road until their legs gave out. He was still the one who loved Jasper first. Jasper had been his horse. A rescue, nervous, stubborn. He was the one who'd taught Jasper how to trust again, how to lean into a hand without fear, how to step forward when someone said his name softly instead of with a whip of command. Laney had always loved watching them together. Now Jasper stood quiet in his stall, and Laney sat outside it with her throat full of unsaid words and her chest hollow. One morning, a month after the funeral, she reached up and unlatched the stall door. She hadn't planned to. Her hand just moved on its own. The latch clicked, and Jasper turned his head. She held her breath, waited for him to back up, to pull away. He didn't. He stepped forward and lowered his head until it touched her shoulder. She pressed her face into his neck and cried harder than she had since the day they put the dirt over the box. The next day, she brought a brush. She didn't speak. She just groomed him slowly, starting at his withers, moving down his flank. He stood like a statue, ears twitching, tail swishing gently. The day after that, she led him to the round pen and walked in slow circles while he followed her. By the end of the week, she was talking again. Not to people, not yet, but to him. "Do you think he knew it was going to rain that day?" she asked. Jasper blinked. "Do you think he was scared?" Jasper snorted softly. "I hope not," she whispered. Each morning, she arrived before school, still too early for anyone else to be up. Her backpack stayed on the barn bench, her thermos on the tack box. She sat on the hay bale near Jasper's stall and read aloud from her brother's old books, the ones with the pages dog-eared and the margins full of jokes in his messy handwriting. She cried less, but she still cried, and Jasper never looked away. One morning she didn't cry at all. She laughed instead, just once. Just a breath of a laugh, but it echoed in the quiet space like a bell. Jasper stepped closer and bumped her shoulder. She smiled. And just like that, something shifted. She began to write again, not competitively, not yet, just slow laps around the paddock, just mornings with the frost still on the ground and her hands stuffed in fingerless gloves. She didn't tell anyone. It was their secret. She kept coming every morning until the day she overslept. She had stayed up late finishing a project, and her alarm didn't go off. She bolted out of bed, ran to the barn still half in her pajamas, and found Jasper loose. He stood just outside the barn, reins dragging in the dirt, his eyes locked on the house like he had been about to come find her. Her heart stopped. She looked at the open stall, at the unlatched gate, at the hoof prints in the dew-soaked grass. "Did you come looking for me?" she whispered. He walked to her and stopped inches away, and she understood. She wasn't the only one who had learned how to stand still in the dark. She wasn't the only one who had grieved. She wasn't the only one who refused to be left alone. She skipped school that day, not on purpose, not exactly, but once she found Jasper standing there, loose and waiting like he'd made the decision for both of them, she couldn't make herself go. Her stomach twisted at the thought of fluorescent hallways and whispered stares, of teachers offering that soft pity voice she hated more than silence. She sent a single text to her mother, "Not feeling well, staying at the barn," then turned her phone off and slid it into her coat pocket. Jasper followed her back inside without a halter, without a lead rope, just walked behind her like he always had with her brother. She latched the stall door gently, gave him a flake of hay, and sat down in the corner of the barn on the folded quilt she kept hidden behind the tack trunk. It was old and thin, and smelled like dust and grain and horsehair. She curled into it and leaned her head back against the wall. Jasper watched her from his stall, chewing slowly, his tail flicking at nothing. She didn't cry this time. She just breathed. That afternoon, she took him out again, this time further than the paddock, past the fence line, down the old trail that followed the creek bed, the one they hadn't used since the summer before her brother died. She'd always avoided it. It was too full of memories, too steeped in the scent of sun-warmed pine and the sound of tires crunching gravel. Her brother's truck always just ahead of her, tailgate rattling as he turned the bend, calling back, "Keep up, Laney." She rode slowly, Jasper's hooves sinking softly into the mossy ground. The trees opened up above them, the sky gray with promise of late-season snow. She didn't have a plan. She didn't need one. For the first time in weeks, she just wanted to be where she was. At the creek, she dismounted and let him drink. Then she sat on the rocks and pulled her brother's old book from her coat, Watership Down, the one he'd made her read 3 times, and opened to the page he'd always loved. She read it aloud. When she finished, she looked at Jasper. "I think he would have liked you better than me," she said. Jasper snorted, lowering his head to nudge her cheek. She smiled. "Okay, fine. Equal." They sat there until the sky darkened and the wind picked up. Then she led him home. That night at dinner, her mother asked, "Where were you today?" Laney didn't lie. "Barn." Her father didn't look up from his plate. Her mother stared at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "Did you eat?" Laney nodded. That was the end of it. She went upstairs after, sat on the floor with the quilt in her lap and Jasper's scent still clinging to her jacket, and wrote her first journal entry since the funeral. "I think maybe I didn't break. I think maybe I bent and bent and bent, and then he found me and stood still until I could uncurl. I think maybe I'm still here." The next morning she went to school, and not because she wanted to, but because she felt strong enough. And Jasper had taught her that showing up was sometimes the only kind of bravery you needed. She stopped crying in the barn every morning, but she still went, every day, because it wasn't just about the tears anymore. It was about the ritual, about remembering, about being remembered. She started riding in the afternoons too, after homework, after dinner. Her mother didn't ask questions. Her father didn't speak much at all. But one night, as she pulled off her boots in the mudroom, her mother said, "You look more like yourself again." Laney didn't know how to respond, because she didn't feel like her old self. She felt different, like something had cracked and regrown in a way she hadn't expected. The grief hadn't left, but it didn't crush her anymore. It rode beside her, and Jasper never let her carry it alone. She started talking to Jasper about things that had nothing to do with grief, about school, about the girl who sat behind her in algebra and always chewed her pencil until it cracked, about the book she was reading, about the dream she'd had where she was flying but couldn't come down because the sky had hands and they wouldn't let go. Jasper listened the same way he always had, still ears forward, tail swishing occasionally like a punctuation mark. The more she spoke, the more she realized how much she'd stopped saying out loud, not just about her brother, but about herself. She hadn't laughed at school in months, hadn't raised her hand, hadn't played music in her room. But now, in the barn, she sang to him sometimes softly when no one else was around. She sang songs her brother used to play on the car radio, songs she used to roll her eyes at, but never skipped when she played them alone. One morning in early spring, she arrived before sunrise and found Jasper restless. He paced his stall, nostrils flaring, hooves shuffling the straw into crooked circles. She stepped inside, brushing her fingers down his shoulder. "Hey," she whispered, "what's going on?" He didn't settle until she slid the halter over his head and led him outside. The air was thick with fog, dew clinging to the fences. She walked him around the paddock, speaking softly, humming one of her brother's old songs until he stopped moving and leaned into her like he was exhausted. They stood there together until the sky began to lighten. That afternoon the vet came. Routine visit, shots, checkups. Jasper stood still for all of it until the very end, when the vet gently palpated his back leg, then paused. "What's wrong?" Laney asked. The vet didn't answer right away. She pressed a little deeper, checked again. Finally she said, "He's stiff. Might be arthritis starting. We'll want to monitor it. No more long runs for a while." Laney nodded, heart sinking. "He's okay, though?" "He's still strong," the vet said, "but he's not young anymore." She knew that. Of course she knew that. But hearing it said aloud made something twist in her chest. It hadn't occurred to her that Jasper might not always be there, that even the strongest ones, especially the ones who carried so much, had limits. That night, she sat in his stall with her arms around his neck and cried for the first time in weeks. "I don't want to lose you too," she whispered. He didn't move, didn't pull away, just stood, still. When she went to school the next day, she told her best friend what had happened. She hadn't told her anything since the funeral. And the words came out fast and shaky, like they'd been waiting at the gate for months, and finally saw it open. Her friend didn't say much, just reached out and held her hand under the table. That was enough. It was the first time Laney realized she could let other people in, even a little. She started bringing more kids to the barn, not all at once, just a few. Friends who didn't ask too many questions, friends who had their own quiets. They brushed Jasper gently, fed him apples, watched her ride him bareback under the wide blue sky. One of them, Mia, asked if horses could feel love. Laney didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, "but they show it differently. They stay." Mia nodded. "I like that." In April, her mother came out to the barn one afternoon, not with questions or casseroles or folded hands, just stood near the fence and watched as Laney walked Jasper in slow loops. Afterward she asked, "Will you teach me?" Laney blinked. To ride? Her mother nodded. And they did. Slowly. Awkwardly. With laughter that sounded rusty but real. That night, her father ate dinner at the table instead of in the den. No one said a word about it. But it felt like the beginning of something. Something that had been waiting in the wings for a long time. By summer, Jasper's limp had grown more pronounced. Laney noticed it first during their morning walks, his back leg dragging just a little longer over gravel, his breathing a touch heavier when he climbed the slope near the old fence line. The vet confirmed it. Early degenerative joint disease. Manageable, but irreversible. It didn't mean the end, not yet. It just meant the pace would slow. So she slowed with him. She stopped riding and walked instead. Led him through the pastures, along trails they'd taken 100 times before. Sometimes she sang, sometimes she told him stories. Sometimes she said nothing at all, just let the birds and the breeze speak between them. The barn became less of a hiding place and more of a heartbeat. It wasn't about grief anymore. It was about presence. About showing up, even on days when it hurt, especially then. Laney started volunteering at the nearby animal shelter, just once a week, feeding, brushing, walking dogs. She didn't mention her brother, didn't mention the accident. She didn't need to. She worked quietly, gently. One of the older volunteers, a man named Dave, told her she had barn hands, steady, quiet, knowing. She took it as a compliment. At school, things shifted too. She raised her hand in English class, joined a book group, started going to lunch again instead of eating behind the gym. When someone mentioned her brother's name, when a teacher paused too long while taking roll, she didn't flinch the way she used to. The ache was still there, buried deep. But it was no longer a storm. It had shape now. She could carry it. One evening, while cleaning Jasper's stall, she found an old photo tucked behind the tack box, water-stained, torn at the edge, her brother grinning atop Jasper's back, arms stretched wide like wings. She sat down right there in the straw and stared at it until the barn lights clicked on with the timer. She brought the photo into the house, taped it to her bedroom mirror. Her mother said nothing. But later that night, when Laney passed by her parents' room, she heard music playing softly. Her brother's playlist, the one he'd always blasted from the truck stereo. She stood in the hallway for a while, hand resting against the doorframe, before turning back to her room. That night she dreamed of Jasper running, not limping, not aging, but running through an open field, his mane lifted by wind, the sky wide and gold above him. In the morning, she wrote the dream down in her journal. He ran like he remembered I was watching. That summer, she spoke at a community memorial for local youth who had passed in the last year. Her name wasn't on the program. She hadn't planned to speak. But when she saw the other families, when she saw the kids sitting quiet in the back rows, eyes rimmed red, fists clenched in their laps, she rose. She told them about Jasper, about the barn, about how the silence didn't break her. It taught her how to wait. And about how grief wasn't just something that hurt. It was something that stayed, that loved, that watched. When she finished, no one clapped. But a girl about her age approached after and said, "I sit in our garage every morning. I thought I was weird." "You're not," Laney said. "You're surviving." The girl nodded, eyes shining. "I wish I had a horse." Laney paused, then said, "Come meet mine." And just like that, the barn opened a little wider. That fall, she brought Jasper to the school's fall festival. Not for rides. He was too old for that now. But just to stand in the paddock, to be brushed and braided by kids with sticky fingers and hearts full of wonder. He stood like a king, like a monument. One boy asked, "Is he magic?" Laney smiled. "Yes, but not the kind with spells." "What kind, then?" "The kind that stays." When Jasper passed the following spring, he went quietly, in the night, in his stall. Laney found him curled against the straw, his eyes closed, as if he'd simply laid down and let go. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She knelt beside him and pressed her forehead to his shoulder, her hands buried in his coat. She whispered, "I know. You were tired. It's okay." The barn was quieter after that. The mornings felt hollow for a while. But she kept going. She kept showing up. She planted wildflowers over his grave in the pasture, and every spring after they bloomed, bright and defiant. Like memory, like legacy, like a horse who once refused to let her go until she could finally stand on her own. Years later, long after high school, and after she'd gone off to college and returned again with quieter eyes and surer steps, the barn still stood. It had aged some. The roof sagged in places, and the paint peeled at the corners, but it still held warmth, and it still held memory. Laney had taken over the morning chores entirely by then. Her parents had finally stopped tiptoeing around her grief once they saw it had rooted into something stronger, something that grew outward instead of pulling her under. She'd come back home after school not because she didn't have plans, but because her plans had changed. She wanted to be close to the place where she'd first felt like she had a voice again, the place where stillness had spoken louder than comfort and patience had pulled her through. She rebuilt the fence that year, board by board, sometimes with help, sometimes alone. She stained the wood herself, her hands stained with the scent of cedar for weeks afterward. And when it was finished, she hung a small carved sign just above the gate. He waited. I learned. She got another horse eventually, a mare this time, young, nervous, high-strung, the kind that flinched at her own shadow and hated the sound of thunder. Laney named her Briar for the way she always seemed on edge, like something caught in her. They didn't click at first, but Laney remembered what it meant to wait. So she waited. Day after day she sat near Briar's stall, didn't ride her, didn't force anything, just sat, read books, listened to music, breathed. And one morning, Briar walked up and rested her head on Laney's shoulder, the same way Jasper had, and something new opened inside her, not to replace what she'd lost, but to stretch around it, to carry it forward. She started writing about it, quietly at first, little blog posts, then essays. Then one day, a letter came from a magazine editor who'd found her writing and asked if she'd ever thought about putting it all into a book. She said no. Then she said maybe. Then she said yes. The book came out 2 years later. It wasn't about Jasper directly, but it was about grief and stillness and waiting, and how some mornings what saves you isn't a person with answers or a voice with promises, but a presence that refuses to let you disappear. The title was simple. He Stood Still, and beneath it, a single dedication. For Jasper, the first to stay, when I didn't know how. The barn was never empty again, not because of crowds or tours, but because people came, quiet people, hurting people, people who didn't want to talk but wanted to sit on the hay bale where Laney once cried every morning, people who asked to touch Briar's mane, who asked about the gray horse buried beneath the wildflowers. Laney told them. Every time, she told them how he never left, how he waited when the whole world walked away, how he didn't need to speak to say everything, and how, on the morning she finally stood without falling apart, he let her go. Not because he was done loving her, but because he knew she could carry it now on her own. She opened the barn for others a year after the book was published, not as a business, not as a rescue, just a place, a space for people to breathe, to be near animals who didn't expect them to explain their pain. There was no name on the mailbox, no social media page, no pricing board near the gate. Just a wooden sign tacked to the door, "Come in, stay as long as you need." They came, not in droves, not loudly, but one at a time. A teenager whose father had gone to prison and left behind a silence too loud for her to sleep in. A young veteran who couldn't stand the sound of sirens and flinched at his own shadow. A woman who had lost her sister in a fire and hadn't spoken more than 20 words in a year. None of them knew each other. None of them needed to. They came and they sat. Sometimes they brushed the horses, sometimes they cried, sometimes they did nothing at all, and that was the point. Laney didn't try to counsel them. She didn't give speeches. She made tea. She kept blankets nearby. She fed the horses and made sure no one was left alone unless they wanted to be. Briar softened too. The wild flicker in her eyes dulled over the months, replaced by something steady. She had become the new sentinel, the one who stood at the gate when someone new arrived, the one who leaned close when a voice broke mid-sentence, the one who nudged a trembling hand until it reached out and found something solid. Laney kept Jasper's bridle hanging by the door. She never used it, never let anyone touch it, but everyone noticed it. And when they asked, she would smile and say, "He taught me how to stay." One day, a letter arrived from a girl who had come to the barn only once, stayed for less than an hour, and left without a word. Laney hadn't remembered her name, but the handwriting was careful, blue ink on thick paper. "You won't remember me, but I remember how your horse wouldn't walk away, and how you didn't ask me why I couldn't breathe. You just let me be there. That was the first time I believed I might be okay again. Thank you for staying." Laney framed the letter and hung it in the tack room. Next to it, she tacked up another page, ripped from her old journal, yellowed with age. "He didn't fix me. He just wouldn't let me fall apart alone." Years later, after the barn had aged and the roof had been replaced twice, someone asked Laney why she'd never turned the place into a program, why she hadn't hired staff, taken grants, built something bigger. She just looked out at the pasture where Briar stood beneath the old oak tree and said, "Because it's already big enough for the people who need it." And that was true. Because the kind of healing that began in that barn was never loud. It didn't wear uniforms or collect ribbons. It didn't need fanfare. It just needed space and someone to stay. And the memory of a horse who once refused to leave, even when the rest of the world did. She sometimes wondered what would have happened if Jasper hadn't stopped that first morning, if he hadn't stood at the stall door while she crumpled into herself, trying not to make a sound, if he had simply turned away like everyone else had, like the teachers who didn't know what to say, like the neighbors who stopped bringing casseroles after 2 weeks, like her father who fell into silence deeper than sleep. She thought about that version of her, the one without the barn, without the stillness, without him. She didn't think that version would have made it. Even now, years later, with her boots scuffed and broken in, with laughter in her lungs again, and days that ended with peace instead of ache, she knew how close she'd come to disappearing inside herself. And she knew he had kept her tethered to the world. Briar had taken over that duty now, not as a replacement, but as a continuation. There were days when Laney would catch her staring at the barn door as someone approached and think, "You know, don't you? You know how to wait?" The barn, too, had become more than wood and straw. It was a memory made physical, a cathedral made of dust and hoofbeats. It held their stories, hers and Jasper's, and all the quiet ones that followed. Each spring she scattered wild flower seeds along the fence line where Jasper had been buried. Not because she needed a marker, but because the bloom felt like a whisper, "He's still here," in the petals. One morning, just after dawn, she walked the pasture and found a young girl standing by the grave, arms wrapped around herself. She was new, sent by someone who knew someone who had once sat in that barn and learned how to breathe again. The girl turned when she heard Laney's steps. "I didn't mean to come here," she said quickly. "You're allowed," Laney said. "It's open." The girl looked down at the flowers. "Was this his?" Laney nodded. "He was yours?" "No," Laney said softly. "I was his." They stood in silence. Then the girl said, "He looks like he was kind." Laney smiled. "He was the first thing in my life that didn't ask me to be okay before staying close." The girl knelt down and touched the edge of the grass. Laney didn't ask why, didn't offer a story, just waited. That was always the heart of it. Waiting, not for a change, not for a confession, just for the moment someone realized they were no longer alone. Later, after the girl had gone, Laney wrote in her journal, "Every time someone new comes here, I wonder if he sees. I wonder if he knows we are still standing. Because he did first." She kept the journal open on her desk, and when she walked out to the barn again, the air smelled like clover and dust and memory. She breathed in deep and stayed, and so she kept the gate open. Years passed, but the pattern never changed. Broken people came, not all of them visibly so. Some wore their pain behind practiced smiles, others with slumped shoulders and averted eyes. Laney never asked. She never needed to. The barn wasn't a place for questions. It was a place for arriving, for remembering, for staying. Sometimes the visitors didn't say anything. They just sat on the bench outside Briar's stall and breathed, letting the quiet settle around them like a blanket. Sometimes they left notes tucked into cracks in the wall, folded slips of paper with scribbles, drawings, single words. Laney saved them all. She kept them in a box labeled "Staying," and when the wind howled loudest through the cracks in the walls, she'd open the lid and read a few. One said, "I didn't think anyone would let me take up space this quietly." Another, "He stood, so I did too." She never got tired of hearing it, never tired of watching it happen again, again, again. The way someone shook when they arrived and stood taller when they left. Not all at once. Sometimes the change was small, sometimes it took months. But it always started the same way. With stillness, with presence, with the soft thump of hooves in straw and the breath of something warm and alive standing nearby, refusing to leave. Briar had her own grave by then, tucked in the west pasture beneath the willow tree that bent so low in the spring it looked like it was trying to kiss the ground. She had gone gently, just like Jasper. The vet had said it was peaceful. Laney had whispered thanks between sobs that day, her forehead resting against Briar's neck as she took her final breath. After that, Laney said she wouldn't take on another horse. But one arrived anyway, a Mustang, untouched, thin, shaking. Dropped off by a rescue group who'd heard about her place from someone else who had once stood in her barn and walked out different. Laney said she'd keep the Mustang only a few days. She named him Atlas, because from the moment he arrived he looked like he'd been holding up the world. He stayed 10 years. They didn't ride him much. He didn't like it. But he learned to trust feet in his pasture, hands on his flank, voices humming quietly in the early morning. He followed kids around like he was guarding them. And Laney, older now, with silver in her braid and lines around her eyes, smiled every time he did. "He's watching for the ones we haven't met yet," she said once. People asked why she never moved, never expanded, never turned the center into something with walls and a board of directors and grant money. She'd just smile. "Because this barn is already big enough," she'd say. "Big enough for what hurts, big enough for what heals." And in the quiet that followed, someone would always nod. She still cried some mornings, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't loss. It was gratitude so deep it felt like mourning. Mourning the girl she used to be, the one who thought no one would ever stay. Mourning what Jasper had given her, what Briar had reinforced, what Atlas carried on. Stillness, after all, was not absence. It was everything that waited for you to return. And she had, again and again and again. She never called it healing, not out loud. Healing sounded too clean, too complete, like something with a finish line you could cross and declare yourself done. That wasn't what this was. This was learning how to carry it without being crushed. This was waking up on days when the air felt heavier than her body, and choosing to walk to the barn anyway. This was standing next to a horse who couldn't say a word, but somehow made her feel more seen than any human had ever managed. This was whispering, "I'm still here," to no one in particular, and letting that be enough. She once told a teenager who had come to the barn after losing her brother in a car accident, "Grief is a room. Sometimes the door is open, sometimes it slams shut. But eventually you learn to live in it. Rearrange the furniture, light a candle, make it less haunted." The girl had cried when she said that, and then she'd smiled. The barn became known as a place without clocks. No one was rushed. No one was told what stage of grief they should be in. Laney banned the phrase, "move on." No one moved on. They moved with. They carried. They walked beside their sorrow, sometimes behind it, sometimes ahead. One fall afternoon, a man in his 60s arrived without notice. He didn't say who sent him, didn't say what he'd lost. He just stood near the pasture fence, watching Atlas graze under the amber leaves. After an hour, he turned to Laney and said, "He reminds me of the one I didn't get to say goodbye to." She said nothing, just walked to the tack room and came back with a brush. "Start with his shoulders," she said. The man brushed in silence for nearly 2 hours. When he left, he didn't say goodbye. He just tipped his cap. But 3 weeks later, a donation arrived in the mail. No note, no name, just a check and a post-it with one sentence, "I stood because he did." Laney added it to the box, the one she kept in the corner of the tack room under the window that caught the morning light. The box that now overflowed with letters, notes, scraps of scribbled thanks, small sketches of horses, and quiet stories from people who had stayed just long enough to remember how to keep going. She opened that box every now and then, usually on the anniversary of Jasper's passing, or her brother's, or the morning when she still woke up with the ghost of crying clinging to her throat. She never read them all at once. She didn't need to. Just one was enough. One reminder that he had stood for her, and that now she stood for others. She had become what he was: stillness, patience, refusal to look away, and every time someone stepped into the barn, broken or grieving or simply afraid to fall apart, she was there. Not to fix them, but to stay, just like he had. And because of that, they did too. She always left the barn lights on at night. Not bright, just one bulb over the tack room door. Enough to cast a soft glow through the darkness. Enough to remind anyone passing by, animal, person, or ghost, that something here was still alive, still open, still watching. Sometimes she'd find footprints in the morning, not always human, once a fox, once a stray dog that lingered near Atlas's stall and left muddy paw prints and a chewed-up tennis ball behind. Once, she was sure, someone had come and gone without stepping inside, just stood at the gate, maybe cried, maybe breathed, maybe remembered. That was okay, too. One night, deep in December, snow fell quietly over the hills, thick and slow. It blanketed the pasture, turned the trees into white ghosts, and muffled every sound until the world felt hushed, reverent. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in a quilt, holding a mug of tea that had long gone cold. Atlas stood just beyond the open gate, his body dusted in white. He didn't move, just stared out into the dark like he was listening for something. She stayed there a long time, remembering. A knock came at the front of the house. She didn't jump, didn't panic, just turned. A boy stood on the porch, 14, maybe 15, wet sleeves, no gloves, eyes full of something she knew too well. He didn't say a word. She didn't ask. She just stepped aside and let him in. Then she walked back to the barn, refilled the water buckets, tossed a little extra hay into the stalls, and whispered "thank you" into the quiet. Not for the boy, not for herself, but for the horse who had taught her what to do when someone needed a place to fall apart. You leave the door open. You stay close. You wait. That boy never gave his name. He came 3 nights in a row. Each time she made tea. Each time he sat in silence. Each time he left before sunrise. On the 4th night, he didn't return. But 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. Folded notebook paper, one line, You didn't say anything, but you stayed. That's the only reason I stayed too." She added it to the box. The box that wasn't just hers anymore. The box that held all the reasons she still believed in standing still. In letting the world come to you. In the power of one horse, one moment, one morning, where grief met presence and was finally understood. She lived her life that way now. Not loudly, not always visibly, but open, watching, waiting, still, and the barn lights never went out. Winter softened into spring the way grief softens into memory, quietly, invisibly, and only noticeable once the thaw has already begun. The pasture turned green again, the trees stretched their fingers back into the sky, and Laney kept showing up. By now, people came from neighboring towns, sometimes further, not for therapy, not for answers, but for that barn, that horse, that story. Not everyone knew the details, but they didn't need to. What mattered was that something happened there, something that could be felt in the floorboards and the silence and the gentle weight of a horse's head in your hands. One morning, as Laney was raking the last of the winter straw out of Atlas's stall, she heard footsteps behind her. Not rushed, not hesitant, just, "Sure." She turned. It was the girl from the hospital, the one who'd visited the barn only once, long ago, with a caseworker and eyes so hollow they barely blinked. She'd sat on the hay bale for 15 minutes, never speaking, and then left. Now she was taller, stronger, holding a duffel bag. "I've been writing," the girl said. "Poems mostly." Laney smiled. "You brought them?" She nodded. "But I want to read them out loud." Laney led her to the corner where the light was best. Atlas leaned over the stall door. The girl sat down, unzipped her bag, pulled out a spiral notebook, and began to read. Her voice trembled at first, but it didn't stop. When she finished, she looked up, breathless. Laney didn't say anything. She just opened her arms, and the girl stepped into them. That night Laney returned to the pasture. The stars were sharp against the dark sky. She stood at Jasper's grave and whispered, "They're still coming." Then she knelt, pressed her hand to the soil, closed her eyes, and stayed as she always had, as she always would. She woke the next morning before the sun, as she always did. The sky was still dark, the air cold with the bite of a lingering winter, but her breath no longer clouded in fear. She dressed in silence, boots soft on the old floorboards, quilt still warm where she left it on the bench. She moved through the house like someone following muscle memory more than thought, down the stairs, through the back door, across the yard to the barn. The door creaked open, same as always. The smell met her first. Hay, wood, damp leather, horses. She inhaled it like medicine. Atlas lifted his head when she entered, blinked slow, and nickered once. She answered with a soft click of her tongue and moved to his stall. He waited while she unlatched the gate, waited as she reached up to stroke his cheek, waited as she pressed her forehead against the space just between his eyes. "Morning," she whispered. No response, none needed. In the years since Jasper, she had come to understand something she hadn't known then. That grief, when carried long enough in open hands, could shape itself into something else. Not joy exactly, but something quieter, something enduring, like the difference between a fresh wound and a scar. You still remembered the cut, but it didn't bleed anymore. The barn filled with light slowly, inch by inch. Dew glittered on the grass beyond the fence. The world woke up. Inside she went through the rhythm. Feed, water, hay, brushing, checking hooves. Nothing special, nothing new, but sacred in its steadiness. By the time the first rider arrived, a boy named Rowan, whose father had died in a house fire the year before, the day was warm and golden. Rowan didn't speak much, but he brushed Atlas with the care of someone who had learned how to handle fragile things. When he finished, he sat beside the old apple crate near the stall door, watching the dust catch the light. "My mom cries in the car," he said, voice soft. Every time she thinks I can't hear her." Laney didn't look away. "I used to cry in here," she replied, "every morning." "Did it help?" She thought about it. "No," she said, "but it meant I hadn't given up." Rowan nodded. "I don't think Atlas likes when people give up." "He doesn't," Laney said. "He won't let them." Rowan leaned against the stall wall, eyes on the horse, and whispered, "Good." That evening, after everyone had gone, she stood in the barn alone. The sun had set, and only the porch light remained, casting long shadows. She stepped outside and turned back to face the barn. It looked the same as it always had, but she didn't. She wasn't the girl who cried every morning anymore. She was the woman who stayed when others came crying. And in that stillness, Jasper still stood. Always would. She began leaving the barn door open in the mornings, even when the wind was sharp or the sky low with rain. Not because the horses needed it, not because it made chores easier, but because someone might need to see it, someone walking, someone passing, someone unsure if the world had any space left for them. The open door said, "You can come in, you can rest here, you won't be asked to explain." They came less often now, not because the need was gone, but because the barn had become part of the land, known, trusted. Its reputation spread quietly, like rumor or prayer. Grief had a way of finding its way to people who knew how to hold it, and the barn, still patient, unchanged, had become one of those people. There was a girl, 15, named Elise. She didn't speak the first 3 times she came, sat on the hay bale, her hoodie pulled low over her face, her hands clenched. On the 4th visit, she reached out to touch Atlas's nose. He flinched, she flinched. Neither moved again. On the 5th visit, she said, "My uncle said I made it up." Laney didn't ask what. She just said, "I believe you." Elisa's shoulders dropped a half-inch, enough to see it. On the 6th visit, she cried. On the 7th, she didn't. On the 8th, she laughed. Once, and startled herself doing it. Laney didn't say much. She never did. That was the point. She simply stayed, and watched, and waited, the way Jasper had. One night the wind howled so loudly that the shutters on the house banged against the siding and a branch split from the tree behind the barn. She went out anyway, pulled on boots, wrapped herself in her coat, and stepped into the barn where the air was warmer, where Atlas stood blinking sleepily. She sat down beside him, back against the post, eyes on the rafters. "You know," she whispered, "I still remember the way he looked at me, like he knew I couldn't take one more step alone." Atlas snorted softly. She reached out and touched his shoulder. "Thank you for carrying that forward." In the morning, the storm had passed. The world was clean again. She left the barn door open, just in case. In early spring, she planted clover near the edge of the paddock. Just a narrow line of it, the way her brother used to do when he was younger. Said the horses liked it better than grass, that it made them feel spoiled. She remembered teasing him about it, saying he treated Jasper better than he treated people. He'd laughed, tossed a shovel her way, and said, "Well, Jasper listens better." She smiled now, thinking about it, digging up the soil with her gloved hands, breathing in the scent of cold earth. She could almost hear his voice in the wind, faint, but there. He'd been gone for years now, but that didn't mean he wasn't present. Some memories didn't fade. They took root. Like Jasper's, like the barn. The program had grown, quietly, naturally. Laney still refused to call it anything official. There were no logos, no printed brochures, just a few flyers at the library and the community center with a phone number and a line in simple font. "If you need somewhere to be, come here." She didn't screen anyone, didn't ask for referrals. The barn had its own way of filtering what it could hold. One day, a boy named Daniel came. He was 17, thin, pale, a jagged scar under his left eye. His foster mom dropped him off and drove away without rolling down the window. Laney met him at the gate, and he looked at her like he was already preparing not to stay. "I don't like animals," he said. "That's okay," she said. You don't have to." "I'm not here to talk about anything." "Good," she said. "I'm not here to ask." He followed her to the barn, kept his distance from Atlas, barely looked around. She showed him the tack room, the feed chart, the wooden stool by the back wall, told him he could sit or leave. His choice. He sat. He came back 3 days later, didn't speak, didn't touch anything, just sat. After a week, he fed Atlas a carrot. After 2 weeks, he asked what happened to Jasper. She told him about the mornings she cried and the way the horse had stood in the door like a stone wall against a storm. Daniel nodded once. "My brother jumped in front of a train," he said. "No one came after me." "I believe you," she said. He didn't cry. She didn't ask. But from then on, he brushed Atlas every Tuesday without fail. That was how it worked. Not with milestones, not with breakthroughs, but with patterns, with breath, with the courage it took to walk through the door again and again. One afternoon, she sat down beside Atlas's grave with her knees folded and her journal in her lap. She wrote, "I stopped crying because I wasn't alone. I started staying because he didn't leave. I found myself in the way his silence kept me alive." She closed the book and leaned back in the grass. Above her, the clouds moved slow. The barn doors creaked softly in the wind. Everything was as it had always been. And still somehow, it all felt new again. She found the photo a week after the anniversary. It had slipped between the pages of one of her old journals, the spine warped from moisture and time. She hadn't opened that book in years. But there it was, her and Jasper. She was maybe 11. He was already full-grown, towering behind her like a myth with hooves. Her brother had taken the picture. You could tell by the way it tilted, slightly crooked, like he'd been laughing when he snapped it. In the photo, she wasn't smiling. She was crying. You couldn't tell unless you looked close. How her eyes shimmered, how her shoulders curled inward. But Jasper was leaning into her, his muzzle tucked over her shoulder. The moment she had forgotten, the camera had kept. She stared at it for a long time. Then she took it out, framed it, and hung it on the barn wall near the stall door. Below it, she placed a small card. "The morning I didn't fall apart alone." People asked about it sometimes. She'd tell them. Other times, she wouldn't have to. They understood the moment they looked at it. There was a woman who came that summer, older than most, maybe 60. Her daughter had died the year before, suicide. She said very little, just brought carrots in a paper bag and sat by the fence. Briar, before she passed, had been the one to reach her first, walked straight up to the woman and laid her head in her lap. "She hasn't done that in weeks," Laney had said. "She knows," the woman replied. She came every Saturday for 3 months. Then one day she didn't. But 3 weeks later, Laney received a package. Inside, a carved wooden figurine of a horse standing in a doorway. A note. "I couldn't stay forever, but she did. Thank you for showing me how." Laney placed the figure on the shelf in the tack room beside her first journal. The spine had broken open completely by then, pages slipping loose, but she kept them all. One page had a line she didn't remember writing. "I was the silence. He was the answer." She copied it onto the chalkboard wall of the reading shed where kids sometimes wrote quotes or doodled with colored chalk. No one erased that line. Instead, they wrote underneath it, "He stood. I stayed. We're still here." Laney stepped back one afternoon reading the wall. She pressed her fingers against one message written in tiny, uneven letters. "He kept breathing, so I did too." She didn't know who wrote it. Didn't need to. That night, she walked the fence line in the dark, stars brittle above her, pasture damp beneath her boots. At the far end, where Jasper and Briar both rested under the wildflowers, she stopped. The air was still. Her heart was too. "I'm still doing it," she whispered. "Still waiting, still watching, still standing." She swore she heard hoofbeats in the quiet. Or maybe it was just her own pulse. But either way, it was steady, and it did not fade. She didn't know the barn had become a monument until someone else called it that. It was a boy, 12 maybe, sitting cross-legged by the front gate sketching in a notebook. He'd been coming for a few weeks, quiet, always watching Atlas from a distance. This time, he pointed to the sketch and said, "It's not just a barn, it's where people come back to themselves, like a place that holds you when you can't hold anything else." She'd knelt beside him, looked at the rough lines of his drawing. It wasn't accurate, not really. The proportions were off, the angles crooked. But it captured something better than precision. It captured feeling. "Do you want to hang it inside?" she asked. He nodded without looking at her. "Only if you keep it up forever." She smiled. "I can promise that." They pinned it beside the photo of Jasper and her. Above it, she chalked in the boy's words, "Where people come back to themselves." People began adding to it. Notes, drawings, bits of ribbon, bracelets made from twine. No one asked permission. They just knew it was the place. The wall of staying, of remembering, of being remembered. One winter, a storm knocked out power for 3 days. She stayed in the barn the whole time, sleeping on the cot she kept tucked behind the feed bins. Atlas grew anxious in the dark, so she kept a lantern lit and read aloud to him from old books. The storm rattled the tin roof and howled through the boards, but inside it was warm, familiar, safe. It reminded her of the first winter after her brother died. How she'd slept in that same barn on nights when the house felt too empty. How Jasper's breath and body heat were the only things that made her feel real. She wrote in her journal that night, the lantern casting her shadow onto the wood. "I didn't survive because I fought. I survived because something stayed beside me and refused to move." In the spring, the girl named Elise came back, the one who hadn't spoken for weeks, who now read poems under her breath while brushing the ponies. She stood in the center of the barn one morning and said, "I think this is what it feels like to be held, not touched, held." Laney just nodded. That was the kind of truth you didn't need to add anything to. And so, on the first warm day of May, Laney stood at Jasper's grave and didn't say a word. She just listened. To the wind in the trees, to the horses breathing behind her, to the silence she now understood wasn't empty, but full. Full of every person who had ever walked through the open barn doors and found, waiting for them, a place where they didn't have to be okay. Just present, just breathing, just here. It was nearly midnight when Laney heard the car tires crunch over gravel. She'd been in the barn, restocking the feed bins by lantern light. The soft hum of crickets outside the only sound in the night. The horses had all quieted, shifting in sleep. Atlas had dozed off standing, his weight resting on one hip, ears twitching in half-dreams. She stepped to the barn door and watched the headlights sweep over the fence line, slow and deliberate, before cutting off entirely. A figure stepped out. A woman, older, shoulders hunched beneath a shawl, moving like someone who had to gather herself before each step. Laney waited. The woman came forward, hesitated at the edge of the porch, then finally said, I don't know where else to go." Laney stepped back and held the door open without a word. The woman stayed 3 nights. She slept in the guest room in the house, but she spent every daylight hour in the barn, not brushing the horses, not riding, just sitting. One day beside Atlas, one day in the hayloft, one day on the steps of the tack room, her hands cupped around a mug she never drank from. On the morning of the 4th day, she stood in the barn doorway and whispered, "My son died in January. I haven't spoken his name in 5 months." Laney was at the feed trough, scooping grain into a bucket. She didn't stop, didn't turn. The woman said, "It was cancer, bone marrow. He was 15, Her voice cracked. "He used to come here years ago, said a horse stood by him while he cried. He didn't tell me until later, after he started smiling again." Laney paused. Her fingers loosened on the handle of the scoop. The woman finally stepped forward, resting a hand on the stall door. Was it Jasper?" Laney nodded. The woman broke then, not loud but wholly. Her hand slid down the wood, her shoulders bent inward. Laney crossed the barn and caught her before her knees hit the ground. "He kept my son alive," the woman wept. "Longer than I knew how to." Laney held her, not speaking. There was nothing to say. After the woman left, she sent a package. Inside was a photograph, a boy in a red hoodie, maybe 13, standing beside Jasper, hand on his mane, eyes full of something both broken and beginning again. Tucked behind the photo was a letter. "This place gave him back to me for a little while. Now I'm giving him back to you." Laney framed it and hung it near the others. Below it, she wrote a single line. He stood for him, too. More stories came, one after another. A mother and daughter who hadn't spoken since the funeral of their father stood side by side brushing the same horse, and without meaning to, started laughing again. A man with a stutter read a full page aloud for the first time while standing knee-deep in straw, a pony nosing at his jacket pocket. A girl with burned scars on her arms taught the youngest colt how to follow her around the pasture with nothing more than a whisper. Laney didn't orchestrate it, didn't advertise it. She just kept the gate unlocked, the porch light on, the barn door open. One evening in late summer, she found a rock resting on Jasper's grave. Smooth, flat, painted gold. Someone had written on it in black marker, "I didn't end things because this place existed." She held it in her palm for a long time, then placed it back where she found it. That night she wrote in her journal, "I thought I'd been saved by a horse, but what he gave me was a map. I just didn't know I'd become the place it led to." And outside, the stars blinked on one by one. Inside, the stillness breathed. She was brushing Atlas the next morning when a breeze came through the open doors, stirring dust motes in golden spirals. He turned his head slightly, ears twitching, sensing something she hadn't yet. Then she heard it too, the crunch of gravel, the soft creak of the front gate. Laney stepped outside, still holding the curry comb. A boy stood there, 16, maybe. Tall, thin, but all his movements were curled inward, shoulders rounded, backpack clutched tight to his chest, like he'd forgotten how to take up space. He didn't say anything. She didn't ask. Instead, she stepped aside and opened the gate wider. He hesitated, then walked through. He didn't speak for the first hour, just watched. The horses, the trees, her. When she offered him a brush, he didn't take it. But when she handed him a small piece of apple to offer Atlas, he did. And Atlas, ever gentle, nudged his hand and took it without so much as a sound. The boy's mouth twitched, not a smile, but a crack in the wall. He came back the next day. And the next, still silent. Until the 6th visit, when he finally whispered, "My brother said this place made him feel like he wasn't ruined." Laney stopped mid-step. She turned to look at him. "Was his name Corey?" she asked. The boy's eyes widened. "Yes," Laney nodded. "He used to sit on the hay bale closest to the back door, always wore the same navy jacket, always asked if he could give Jasper a second apple." The boy blinked hard. "He talked about it," he said. "He said Jasper saved him." Laney rested a hand on Atlas's neck. "He did. He saved me, too." The boy's shoulders trembled once, then stilled. From then on, he never missed a week. He wrote something on the chalkboard wall every time he came. Small phrases, quiet declarations. Still breathing? Stayed the whole day. Didn't run this time. Each one was a mile marker on a map of return. Laney stopped erasing them. She let them live there, layered over one another like stories passed down in whispers. One spring morning, a package arrived addressed simply to "The Barn That Doesn't Leave." Inside was a thick stack of letters, dozens of them, some typed, most handwritten, many signed with only first names or initials. Laney sat on the tackroom floor for hours reading them. I sat in silence for 26 minutes beside a horse and remembered I still had a heartbeat. You didn't ask me to smile. That's how I knew I could. My father left. My brother died. My mother stopped seeing me. But that horse leaned into me like I mattered. That saved me. She wept, not like she had as a girl, quiet and hidden, but open, grateful, alive. That night she walked to Jasper's grave, the grass damp with dew and wild clover curling around her boots. She knelt, ran her hand over the soil and said, "They're still coming." Then she sat there, in silence, as the stars came out, as the world spun forward, and as breath after breath moved through her like wind through open doors. She had stayed, and because she did, they kept coming back, and none of them ever had to cry alone again. She added a second bench outside the barn that summer, not because there were crowds there never were, but because sometimes two people needed to sit near each other without speaking, because sometimes healing looked like shared silence. One day a boy and girl sat there for nearly 3 hours, not a single word exchanged between them. When they finally stood to leave, the girl wiped her eyes and said softly, "It helped." That was all. Laney didn't ask what. She didn't need to. The barn knew. So did the horses. So did Jasper, if not in body, then in legacy. By fall, the chalkboard wall was full, not just scribbled notes anymore, but entire conversations. Gratitude, pain, hope, little jokes, shared memories. Some names repeated, most didn't. And in the center, still untouched from the day it was written, remained the first line, "He didn't fix me. He just wouldn't let me fall apart alone." One of the kids suggested they paint the words above the barn doors. Laney agreed. They spent an afternoon tracing the letters, white paint on weathered wood. When they finished, a hush fell over the yard. Even the wind seemed to pause. That night, someone left a candle burning on Jasper's grave. No note, just the flame, flickering against the grass like a heartbeat. Laney watched it from her porch, her arms wrapped in a quilt, her chest full of the kind of ache that only comes from remembering how far you've come. She thought about that first morning, the cold, the straw, the way his muzzle pressed into her cheek when she couldn't stop crying. She thought about how he'd stood in the stall doorway the day she didn't show up, like he was ready to come find her if she didn't return. She thought about all the ones who had come since, and she whispered into the night, "I'm still here, I'm still staying." "Because you did." Then she stood, closed the gate, left the porch light on, and went to sleep, knowing that in the morning someone else would arrive with a heavy heart and trembling hands and no words at all, and she'd meet them at the barn door with a nod and silence and space and a presence that didn't ask for anything but breath. She got a call one evening from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. The sun was down, the barn was dark, and she'd just pulled off her boots after a long day of brushing, feeding, walking the pasture. But something told her to pick up. A voice on the other end was shaky but familiar. Is this Laney?" "Yes," she said, sitting upright. "This is Jonah Riker. I came to your barn years ago. I never said much, but you let me stay." Laney smiled, heart already swelling with something too big for language. "I remember." There was a pause. "I wanted you to know," he said slowly. "I work with kids now, at a shelter. I tell them about Atlas, about how sometimes just breathing near something steady can change your whole life." She closed her eyes. "Thank you," he said, "for giving me the space to remember who I was." When they hung up, she sat for a long time in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around a warm mug and tears slipping silently down her cheeks, not from grief, but from recognition. That's what Jasper had given her. That's what she had passed on. And now it had become something even bigger, a legacy of presence, a lineage of stillness. The next morning she walked the barn before sunrise. She paused by Jasper's marker, knelt in the damp grass, and whispered, "They're carrying it now, not just me." The barn felt alive with memory, alive with breath, alive with the echo of hooves and tears and long silences filled by something stronger than words. She stood, turned toward the pasture, and opened the gates wide, just in case someone else was already walking down the road, looking for the place where they wouldn't be asked to explain why they'd come, only whether they wanted to stay. Later that year, she built a small structure beside the barn. Just a lean-to at first, open on one side, a roof to keep the rain off. Inside she placed a bench, a shelf with notebooks and pencils, and a small wooden box with a sign on it. If you're not ready to speak, you can write. If you can't write, you can sit. If you can't sit, you can stay. She called it the quiet room, even though it wasn't really a room. The first person to use it was a woman in her 40s who hadn't spoken since her partner died 2 years earlier. She came with her arms crossed, her jaw clenched, and a grief so thick it felt like it dragged behind her when she walked. She sat for hours, didn't touch the pencils, didn't look at the shelf. Then one day she left a note in the box, just 3 words. "It doesn't hurt." Laney read it and cried, not because the pain was gone, but because someone had remembered what it felt like not to be swallowed by it. The notebooks filled slowly over the months, snippets of poems, letters never sent, pages of scribbled questions. Some wrote prayers, some drew, some only signed their names. She kept them all, bound them by season, labeled each collection by hand. Volume 1, He Waited. Volume 2, We Stayed. Volume 3, They Returned. One day she hoped to publish them, anonymously. Not as a book, as a testament, a monument built not of marble or brass, but of moments when people chose to stay. In October, a horse arrived from a neighboring county rescue. Dark chestnut, tall, bones sharp under a dull coat. His name had been Thunder, but Laney renamed him Quiet. Not because he was silent, but because his stillness hummed like something you could sit inside. He was slow to trust, nervous around new hands. But one afternoon, a young boy with a stutter sat beside his stall and began to read aloud, haltingly, painfully, word by word. Quiet listened, didn't flinch, didn't blink, just stood. That boy came back every day for 6 weeks. He read everything from Dr. Seuss to Tolkien, his voice steadier each time. On the 42nd day, Quiet laid his head across the boy's shoulders, and the boy whispered, "I didn't think I'd ever be enough." Laney was cleaning stalls when she heard it. She turned her face into her sleeve so no one would see her cry. The barn didn't belong to her anymore. Not really. It belonged to every person who had ever needed a place to grieve without being told to move on. It belonged to every trembling voice, every silent sit. Every morning someone stood at the gate and wondered if they'd be welcomed, and were. It belonged to Jasper, to Atlas, to Briar, to the unspoken promise made in every breath of hay and dust and light. You don't have to heal quickly. You just have to arrive, and keep arriving, and let someone stay beside you while you remember how. Some mornings she'd wake before the alarm and sit on the edge of her bed listening, not for anything in particular, just listening to the silence of the house, the slow creaks of old floorboards beneath her feet, the soft wind through the trees beyond the window. It wasn't the kind of silence that once frightened her, when it meant grief had hollowed the walls of her home, when it echoed with what had been lost. No, this was the kind of silence that wrapped around her gently, like an old friend returning. She would pull on her boots, wrap a sweater around herself, and walk to the barn in the half-light before dawn. Sometimes the fog still clung to the field. Sometimes the frost shimmered silver across the grass. Always the barn stood waiting. That morning, she found a note pinned to the inside of the barn door, written in pencil, paper damp at the corners, no signature. "I sat here 5 years ago. I was 13. I didn't speak for months. You didn't ask me to. But Jasper stood by me for 2 hours, and you brought me tea without saying a word. I just wanted you to know I speak now. I speak a lot. I became a therapist. I teach kids to listen to horses. I never forgot. Thank you." She read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in the wooden box on the shelf in the quiet room. Volume 4. They were on Volume 4 now. She sat with Atlas for a while. He was older, slower, but still carried a watchfulness in his eyes that made people feel known. "Do you think he knows?" she asked him softly. What he started. Atlas blinked. She took that as a yes. She stayed in the stall until the sun rose fully, until the warmth poured in through the rafters and lit the hay in golden ribbons. And for a while she didn't think about the past or the future or the weight of things. She just breathed. That afternoon a family arrived, a father and 2 young girls. The older one had lost her mother 6 months earlier and hadn't spoken since. The younger clung to her sister's hand like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Their father looked tired. He looked like he was holding his breath every minute of every day. Laney didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't say anything. She led them to the pasture, showed them the bench, let them be. They stayed for hours. The girls sat under the willow. The father brushed Atlas with slow, unsure hands. No one cried, no one spoke. But when they left, the youngest turned back, let go of her sister's hand just long enough to wave. Laney waved back. It was enough. And that night, as the horses rested and the barn lights dimmed, she pulled out her journal and wrote, "Some people come back to life a piece at a time, a breath, a hand, a nod, a horse standing still. No one saves anyone. We just stay long enough to remind them they can." And then she turned out the light and went to bed and slept peacefully.